order. We only have one agenda item this afternoon, discussion and possible action for the presentation of the financial and single audit report for the Bossier Parish School Board and the AUP report for the Bossier Educational Excellence Fund, presented by Allen Green and Williamson, LLP. Good evening.
Good evening. Good evening, board. How are y'all today? Kind of nasty. So my name is Cindy Thomason. I'm a principal with Allen Green and Williamson, and it was our honor last year to be your auditor for 2022. And of course, you know, the purpose of an audit is to give an opinion on the financial statements, and we also perform a compliance audit. Our opinion, so we're going to kind of start with this book, which is the annual comprehensive financial report. A little bit of trivia. The school board participates in the GFOA and the ASBO, which is the governmental financial officers, and the Association of School Board Administrators. And last year they received the Excellence in Reporting Awards, and those certificates are also in this report on page 17 and 18, just a little trivial. And I think they've received it every year for the past 29 years, so that's something to be proud of. Our actual opinion is on page 25, and when we issued what we consider an unmodified opinion, and that means that we say that your financial statements are fairly presented in all material aspects, and that is what we consider a clean opinion. That means that's the best opinion that you can get. We didn't have to qualify it for any except fors and things like that. So but I recommend that you read that, because it also gives the details of your responsibilities as management of the school board and our responsibilities as being the auditor for the school board. Then on page 31, that begins what we call the management discussion and analysis. And that kind of gives a summary of the results from prior year and does some comparisons from prior year, how things changed based on the stuff, and then there's explanations in there that kind of give some details of why things changed from 2022 to from 2021. There's good tables on page 35 and 34. And the school board is what we consider a government, and you have to follow the governmental auditing standards, or GASB as we call it. And governmental entities, they actually have to present two types of financial statements. One is what we consider governmental activities, and that's reported on a full accrual. That's like any business. All your assets, all your liabilities are reported there. And that includes your capital assets and your debt and stuff. And those financials are on page 47 and page 48. And at the end of the year, the school board had a deficit of $547 million. But don't panic, most of that is related to the OPEB pension liability and the net pension liability. And both of those, they actually reduced your ending fund net position by $780 million. And net pension liability, basically you've met your obligations for that, but it kind of lets the readers know what the shortfall is for their retirement plans.
Every year.
Huh?
Would you please clarify that this is a bureaucratic
the net pension liability is
matter that we actually are better than most, but everybody, I think every school board in
every school board does that has to report teachers' retirement, and
that throws everybody into this quote deficit.
Yes, because what you do is based on your salaries, you get what they consider a net proportionate share of the shortfall for those retirement systems. So basically, if the retirement system had to pay out, there would be a shortfall for all the retirement that earned to date. But then the OPEB liability, that is the school board's responsibility. That's if you had to meet, because the school board offers health insurance for its retirees after retirement. And so, and this is, of course, an actuarial determined liability and stuff. At the end of the year, the OPEB liabilities is $627 million. And that is something that the school board will have to come up with ongoing every year with, whereas the net pension liability, you've met your obligations. You've paid your required contributions to the net pension liability. But those all total, like I said, $780 million, and that is, more than, that's what's causing that deficit net position. And the second set of financials that's presented is what we call the governmental fund accounting, and it's based on what we call a modified accrual, and it's based on current resources, and it's usually 60 days. So any revenue that you've earned up to 60 days is included, but nothing long-term. And so your capital assets, your long-term debt, so as far as your bonded debt and those net pension liabilities, they're not on this set of financial statements. But this is basically what you budget based on. And at the end of the year, the school board had $193.5 million in what we call fund balance. And that's the difference between your assets and your liabilities. And so that's a difference. And if you take what your fund balance is at the end of the year and you consider the expenses that the school board had during the year, you have approximately 3 months worth of reserves. You have 3 months of expenses in your fund balance at the end of the year. Your general fund at the end of the year had $84.7 million. The biggest increase was that is related to the transfers that it got to receive from the ESSER monies, from the education stabilization. And because you received $5 million in indirect costs related to that, to those grants. That was the biggest part of that increase. And the school board also had an increase in sales tax last year. And, we don't know how long that's going to continue to. The Education Excellence Fund, which is the accounting for the permanent fund for the casino monies. Last year, you actually received $2.8 million in casino revenues, and of course those go into what we call a permanent fund. Those are non-spendable funds, and for your what we call BEEF, those BEEF excellence, only the interest earned in the last calendar year is expendable for the school board, and the residual amounts for that. And at the end of the year, you had $1.4 million that's still left that can be expended of those interest earnings. And that's one good thing we can say about the Fed rate going up. Those interest rate earnings should go up considerably next year, this fiscal year, compared to the ones in the past. And of course, and then your education stabilization, that's the money that's been allocated based on some of the CARES Act and those grants. And so last year you received almost $33 million in revenues that were expended. And they were spent on various programs that probably Nisha could understand, explain to you more what was spent for those funds. And the last column is what we consider our non-major governmental funds. Those is what we consider in governmental accounting, that they're not together they get aggregated because they're not considered significant or major. And those are mainly made up of your debt service, your capital asset, and your other special revenue funds. And at the end of the year, you did have a decline of $9.5 million in those funds, and that's mainly because of your capital project spending those bond proceeds received in prior years. That's your current year expenditures or building construction projects, and also spending of the insurance proceeds that you received from the storm damage. And then also your school lunch actually had an increase of almost $2 million last year, in increase in fund balance during the 2020 year. And then on page 57 starts what you call your internal service fund. And that's what's accounting for your health insurance. At the end of the year, you did have a deficit of almost $1 million. That actually is an increase of last year of up $400,000, but the only reason why it had that slight increase is because the ESSER money transferred to it $4 million to cover COVID medical expenses, or it would have been significantly higher deficit. So I know we're hitting high spots, but is any questions on the financials? Huh?
You can continue.
Okay. So that's really what we're going to cover in the financial reports. I do have some business cards or anything like that. If anybody wants to call and personally talk about any of the items that was listed in there, you're welcome. And they're also, my phone number is in the letterhead on the audit report if you would like to contact me. The next section we're going to see is the compliance audit, and this is the one that's called single audit. And any government or any entity, really doesn't even have to be in government, that receives over $750,000 in federal revenues have to have what we call a single audit. And of course, you definitely fit those. We have two letters in here that begin on page 5, and these kind of go over what a compliance audit is in relation to a governmental auditing standards. And then on page 7 is our report for a compliance audit in accordance with what we call the uniform guidance, which is the federal single audit guidance. And I really highly recommend that you read those. They're informative. It kind of gives, like I said, some more of what our responsibility is and what your responsibilities is. And then on page 10 and 11, this is what we call the schedule of expenditures of federal awards. And this gives all the details of what federal dollars you received by a federal assistant listing number, and it kind of gives the name and the dollar amount. And at the end of the year, the school board actually received $64.6 million in federal assistance, and to be used to further the education of the children of Bossier Parish. And then on page 12 kind of gives a relationship to which funds in the financial statements receive those federal dollars. And then on page 13, this is what we call the summary of the auditor's results. And for the financial statement audit, as I said earlier, that the type of audit report issued was unmodified, but there was one significant deficiency required to be disclosed by the governmental auditing standards, and there was one instance of noncompliance considered to be material as defined by the governmental auditing standards. That was actually the same finding. It just happened that it was a compliance audit, so it gets in both those sections. The audit of federal awards, we had no findings related to that, and listed below and under the number 7, it tells you which that we tested as major funds for the single audit, and most of those were the Education Stabilization Fund and then the Emergency Connectivity Fund. And both of those are related, are the COVID-19 funds. On page 14, it lists the finding, and the finding is really just a late submission of the audit report to the legislative auditor. There is a law that requires that your audit report be submitted to the auditor by December the 3rd, no later than midnight, December the 31st. The main reason why for the late filing was because the issues that we had with the OPEB report. You know, as stated, it's based on an actuarial study. And I don't know what GASB was thinking when they did it. Everybody has to have the actuarial report for their OPEB study in the same year. So it's very busy for the actuary that year, and she was sick. It was just different circumstances. We weren't able to get the OPEB report in time to be able to issue an opinion on the financial statements. And there was one management letter item that's listed on 17, and it's just related to the financial year-end close. It's just that some of the balance sheet accounts and stuff just require some additional work after they gave us the financial, the trial balance. But you can read that and read our recommendation, and then management's response is listed on page 18. Anybody have any questions? And then we're also required to do what they call statewide AUP, agreed upon procedures. And those begin on page 21. I believe there was a couple of exceptions that we found in the defense of all school boards or all governmental entities. You don't know what they want you to test or what they consider significant until after the year's over almost. So, and I do believe that the finance office has been working on clearing these up. And then the last part that we have to do is what we call the BPSB procedures. The Board of Education, you have to, required that we perform these procedures, and they're based on, they just want us to test the underlying data that the school boards send to them so that they can do certain reports and stuff like that. And I believe there was only one exception, and it was just that they used the wrong accounting object code, but there was no other exceptions. And then, of course, we tested these schedules that are listed on page 32 and 33. Any questions? And then the last little book, I'm afraid I don't have a copy, is our agreed upon procedures that we do that's required by law for your the Education Excellence Fund. And there are certain procedures we have to make sure that you complied with the law and that you didn't spend any of the principal and you didn't expend more interest than was earned as of January 1st of 2022, and there was no exceptions in that test work that we found.
Does the board have any questions of Ms. Thomason?
And I believe that we need kudos to the artwork that's in the thing. I think it was very colorful and artful, and I believe those are from all the students within the parish. Makes it very, yes.
Thank you for your presentation. Ms. Bamberg, thank you. Where are you at? No questions, and Finance Committee is dismissed. In about 8 minutes for the board meeting.